The following fake advertisement contains a voice generated through AI. It in no way represents a real product or the real actor.
This episode of Moving Panels is brought to you by Captain Protein Bars. Listen up, fool. If you want to be strong like Mr. T, you got to fuel up right. Ain't no time for jibber jabber. These ain't no ordinary snacks. Captain Protein Bars are packed with muscle-building protein and heroic flavors to keep you powered up all day. It's like a 1-2 punch to hunger. You hear me? Each bar is bursting with nuts, oats, and chocolate chunks so tasty, even superheroes can't resist. You want to be tough? You want to be strong? Then grab yourself a Captain Protein bar and get ready to conquer the day. And guess what, sucker? Every bar comes with a collectible superhero card. That's right. Now you can snack and collect your favorite heroes at the same time. Ain't that something? So quit messing around with weak snacks. Get yourself a Captain Protein bar and show the world what you're made of. I pity the fool who doesn't. Stay strong, stay mighty, and stay ready for anything. Captain Protein Bars, because even heroes need a powerful snack. You got that? Good.
Welcome to this Moving Panels One Shot. Let's have a nerdy little conversation. And in honor of the 2024 Paris Olympic Games, we have been discussing the gold, silver, and bronze age of comics, and we have made it to the end. Today we are discussing the Bronze Age. This is the era of comics with major changes that really just kind of continued the growth of all of the social and deeper aspects that began with the Silver Age. But once again, let me introduce our co-host throughout this journey of the ages, Mr. Reece Fowler.
Thank you, Laramy. It is good to be with you again, and looking forward to wrapping up these gold, silver, and bronze ages. Hopefully I'll know a little bit more this time.
Yeah, we're getting into more modern times here. Of course, the Silver Age saw the return of the superhero, as we talked about in the last one-shot, and it also developed more of what we know as the modern storytelling of comics. What the Bronze Age would do would continue this and would honestly go a little bit darker with a lot of their storytelling. But let's go ahead and jump into it. So the Bronze Age of comics began around 1970, 72, 73, whatever. We're going to get into why I don't exactly have an exact date here. But of course, this is the 1970s. The world is undergoing significant social and political upheaval in the world, and comic books, as we talked about with the Silver Age, are definitely going to reflect that. And so in the Silver Age, we dealt with things like counterculture and the race movement and all that. Correct. But here in the 70s, we'll still deal with racism, but now we've got things like environmental issues. We've got drug problems and, the drug addiction, drug crisis, I guess you would say, becoming a bigger issue in America.
Right.
But again, I don't have a clear start because unlike and let's quiz Reece a little bit here. So the beginning of the Golden Age was
Superman,
and the beginning of the Silver Age was
that was like the Archie comics.
Nope, not Archie comics.
No, not
it was another DC character. He got a sci-fi rebrand.
Flash.
The Flash. There we go.
Yeah, I knew it would come to me.
But the Bronze Age doesn't have one of those crystal clear, this is the beginning. Some say it is when Jack Kirby, who really got Marvel going, it's when he left Marvel and actually went to DC. As one of the first big, moving of rival companies.
Yeah, that would be huge.
Yeah, so Jack Kirby left Marvel. He went to DC, where he then created the Fourth World. This is the Apocalypse and characters like that. But there were several changing of the guards that happened during this time, and the business was changing. Comics no longer were the cheap mass marketed, get it off the newsstand that we talked about, with the Golden Age, with
right.
The fact that it was so popular during World War II because it was a form of entertainment for the soldiers. Now we have TV, we have movies. Newsstands aren't really a thing. And so we get comic book shops. That's what starts happening here.
Okay.
So another kind of beginning of this Bronze Age. Some people, if they want to put it to a comic, we'll say the Bronze Age started with the release of Green Lantern, Green Arrow. So Green Lantern, Green Arrow, number 85 and 86, that came out in 1971, because they tackled the issue of drug addiction. This is a very infamous story where they find out that Speedy, Green Arrow's sidekick, is addicted to heroin.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, very powerful storyline there. Something that, hadn't been seen in previous decades. So to ask you a question, why do you think it was important for comics to start addressing these real world issues?
Well, I mean, again, that was the issue at the time, so it was something that the reader could actually relate to, maybe?
Yeah. Again, just like with the Silver Age, this was things that became more relatable. It made things more relevant. Because if you remember, that was what kind of put an end to the Gold Age, was that no one related to superheroes anymore. And so they went more with the romance and the westerns, and then sci-fi came in. So sci-fi and horror kind of became a thing, and more into the Silver Age. But now that we've gotten to the Bronze Age, you had to connect a little bit more with the reader, and so that is what they are doing by showing these issues. And even though people talk about this Green Lantern, Green Arrow issue, Stan Lee actually had done a drug addiction story earlier, before this, with Spider-Man.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it was a 3-part storyline that dealt with drugs, and it was a big deal because he released the comic without the approval of the Comics Code Authority.
Oh.
Because that was something that they did not approve of. The Comics Code Authority would never approve a comic that talked about drugs.
Did that get him in trouble?
And not really, because because again, the Comic Code Authority was not any type of really enforceable, like you're not going to get this or you're not going to get that. It was really just more of an appeasement to people.
Okay.
That, it has this code, so it's okay for my kid to read this comic. It was more just a frowned upon type thing. But Stan Lee had actually been asked by the United States government to do this story.
Oh, okay.
So that is what he focused on. And of course, you've got the X-Men with Marvel still continuing to be a representation for minorities. And of course, this would adapt not just to... the X-Men wouldn't be only something about the African-American struggles around this time, but you start getting into even more stuff dealing with Jewish people. You've got stuff dealing with just any other type of immigrant, really.
Okay.
They start pretty much any minority. The X-Men were starting to represent more and more. Tony Stark, which was introduced in the Silver Age, he starts dealing with alcoholism. A very big storyline or story. Or let me not even say story, a very big characteristic of Tony Stark,
right,
is that he does deal with alcoholism. Something that they maybe played with a little bit, I would say, in Iron Man 2 with Robert Downey Jr. in the MCU.
Yeah, I do remember that.
But they've never really gone the route that the comics did. And then you've got the female empowerment. I mean, again, this is the 70s. There's a lot more about female empowerment, so we introduced characters like Spider-Woman and Miss Marvel, who would later become Captain Marvel.
Okay.
Again, for those of you who don't know, there's Miss Marvel does become Captain Marvel, and then the Miss Marvel that exists now is not the same Miss Marvel. But and then She-Hulk also becoming big here. And again, they were there to represent female empowerment. I won't say that it was great on their part, because they were really just female versions of the male superheroes. They really didn't have their own identity at this point yet. But yeah, I mean, by addressing these real world issues, comics could resonate more deeply with their audience, and it helped reflect the complexities of the world we were living in at the time. Well, I say we, I wasn't born yet, but...
I was there.
But it did show that superheroes could confront the exact same problems that everyone else faced, which, of course, like I said, that got started in the Silver Age, but would go even further here. But let's talk about characters.
All right.
Another character that became big was the anti-hero. Now, I'm not talking about the Taylor Swift song. And of course, let me get your perspective on this. So, what or who do you think of when I say anti-hero?
Maybe someone like Wolverine,
Yeah, Wolverine would definitely could definitely be categorized as an anti-hero.
because he really
So,
doesn't know which way he wants to go. It's like, I'm doing good for the.
yeah, essentially they are more ambiguous in their thought process. They are heroes, thus
Right.
anti-hero,
Right.
but they may go about things in not a very traditional heroic way.
Oh, all right.
Like,
All right.
it's kind of like like there's the the lie that people say about Batman, but Batman does not kill. Yes, he does. He's done it several times.
Yeah.
Uh, and so some people could say that Batman sometimes falls under anti-hero.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
But definitely, my first thought is always when you say anti-hero and I'm thinking comic books, my first thought is always the Punisher.
Now, see, I don't know a whole lot about Punisher, so that wouldn't be one that would come to mind for me.
Yeah, so I mean, and he was really a creation of this time, because you look at movies like Death Wish, Charles Bronson.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Now, see, I know that one.
Where he is the hero, but he's going to take anyone out that wronged him or his family or gets in his way of
Correct.
his revenge.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is essentially what the Punisher is.
Okay.
And then you've also got characters like Ghost Rider that is introduced around this time.
Oh, Johnny Blaze, was it not?
Yep.
I like Ghost Rider.
And but again, Ghost Rider is an anti-hero. He's a good guy, but especially the early versions of Ghost Rider, he was essentially a demon.
Right.
So it was only the Johnny Blaze part of him that kind of kept him a good guy.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have characters like that are a little bit more grittier, different look to what heroism could be. It's not just black and white. They kind of start creating some of this gray area,
Okay.
which reflected this appetite people had here in the 70s for, I mean, not to sound negative, but for a darker side of human nature.
I understand that.
Yeah, which like I said, we got into, movies around this time. Like I said, the Charles Bronson stuff, Clint Eastwood, all of that. We hadn't quite hit action movies yet, but we had hit these crime dramas where, we're rooting for someone to essentially murder the villain.
Right, yeah.
And this bled into even the different genres, horror, and science fiction, fantasy, all of those horror. Not just horror, but all of these other genres, we get Swamp Thing, who, again, could also fall under that kind of anti-hero type character. We get the Tomb of Dracula, which would, focus on Dracula as the main character, but then would later introduce Blade as a primary character.
Okay.
And it is interesting to talk about this Tomb of Dracula because a reoccurring theme throughout all of these ages is the Comic Code Authority. The Comic Code Authority did not allow vampires in comics. So
why was that?
It was just one of those, they thought it was too, you got to think, vampires, a little bit too violent, a little bit too scary. There's the seductive element of
okay.
Dracula, and vampires in general.
Got it.
So when they first became a thing in the 1950s, vampires were out. You couldn't do vampires in a comic. They did find the loophole, which is why it's the Tomb of Dracula. They did find the loophole in the Comic Code Authority because it was as long as the characters were literary, they were allowed.
Okay. Dracula was definitely literary by then.
Yeah. Although they did change things up in the 70s, which is why we're talking about it here. The Comic Code Authority did lighten up the restrictions, and so you were allowed to use vampires. So then we get characters like Morbius. You're allowed to use werewolves, and so we get the Werewolf by Night story. And so we start to get to see a little bit more of that. So again, that change and going a little bit darker and grittier. And so I will just ask, so how do you think these new genres? So now we've got characters like Swamp Thing, we've got Blade, who has this, and Ghost Rider, who have these like horror elements to them. We're getting Doctor Strange with this more fantasy element to him. How do you think that they influenced the industry?
Well, it would definitely give something for everyone type vibes to me. Because maybe I don't like a vampire, but I might like a werewolf, or it. The first thing that I can think of is it just gives me an option, something else I can go look for. Maybe it's not a Superman type character. Maybe I do like the Western more, or just
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, because you also got Jonah Hex, Western character that would become, and I think it was now bringing all of this together. So like you said, it was reaching a broader audience. Not that these didn't exist before. I mean, there were horror comics, there were romance comics, there were sci-fi comics. All of them existed. I think it was now bringing it together so that, yes, I could read a Superman comic, and then later I could switch over and read a Green Lantern comic, and I still felt some connectivity between them.
Okay.
Or I could move on to a Swamp Thing comic, and I could still feel some connectivity between them. But I totally agree with what you said about it does reach a broader audience. And if you notice, that's the thing that kept happening with each one of these ages. It was adapting to the time so that you could reach more and more people based off of the issues, the topics, just the life that people were living at this time. So yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly what it would be. And of course, we're still dealing with racism, but we're into the 70s now, so there's a lot more diversity happening with the comics because we are more accepting of minorities. And so you've got Black Panther in Marvel. You've got the Falcon that would come in. They would come in towards the end of the 60s, so right before the Bronze Age.
Right.
But then Marvel would do something revolutionary at the time, and that would be give a African American his own series. Do you know what character that was? I'm just curious. What African American character was the first Marvel character to actually get his own comic book?
Yeah, if you asked me that question without already saying Black Panther, I would have gone Black Panther because that seemed like a logical choice to me. But no,
it would, but it is not.
Yeah, I can't think of.
This is a character that has not been introduced officially into the MCU. He did have his own show that came on Netflix. Of course, now you can see it on Disney Plus.
Okay. Not helping.
There is a famous actor who actually took his stage name, his last name, from this character. That actor is notoriously a famous Superman fan, but he actually took his stage name from this Marvel character.
Yeah, still not helping.
All right. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about, so Nicholas Coppola, which is his real name, did not want the Coppola name attached to him because he didn't want to look like his fame as an actor was due to nepotism from being related to the famous director Francis Ford Coppola. So he was a big comic book fan, and he decided to change his last name from Coppola to Cage.
No way.
So he is Nicolas Cage, who took his name from the first African-American superhero to star in his own series, Luke Cage.
There you go.
A.k.a. Power Man.
Okay.
So for those of you who didn't know that, little trivia there, Luke Cage was the first African-American superhero to have his own comic book. Storm, of course, also, an African goddess, even though she's mutant, but an African character who she becomes kind of the first major African-American member of a superhero team with the X-Men.
Okay.
Justice League didn't really have an African-American main member. The Avengers didn't really have a main. I mean, Black Panther was kind of a side Avenger, but wasn't a main Avenger. So Storm was kind of the first main member of a major team. Then we're also introduced to Monica Rambeau, who many now know from the Marvels. We've got Misty Knight, for those of you who remember her from the Netflix series. Jon Stewart as another Green Lantern. We've got characters like Bronze Tiger, Black Lightning, who was DC's first African-American character to get a solo series, but that was after Luke Cage over at Marvel.
Right.
But just to give him credit as DC's first. DC also had Vixen, Cyborg. So we got all these African-American characters that, you almost can't see comics nowadays without these characters being main major characters.
Yeah, they are.
I mean, Falcon would later become Captain America. John Stewart would be the Green Lantern that I think some people prefer over Hal Jordan. Especially when you talk about the 2001 Justice League animated series that featured him as the member.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I love John Stewart as the Green Lantern. Of course, Cyborg becoming another when they rebooted everything with the Justice League, he became one of the founding members of the Justice League and featured in the Zack Snyder movie, and of course Teen Titans, which is where he was originally introduced. But then, like I mentioned earlier, you even got the Jewish representation, Kitty Pryde, Shadowcat from the X-Men, of course Magneto we had already talked about. Moon Knight, for those of you who didn't know, Moon Knight is a Jewish character.
Didn't know that. Yeah, it really enjoyed the series though.
Yep, in the comics he is a Jewish, so we got Jewish representation, and it continues to grow the awareness. We get more representation in the media. John Byrne would take She-Hulk and make She-Hulk a little bit more of a primary figure, to kind of separate her from the Hulk a little bit more, and so you would get more of the female representation. And it just made, as we just keep saying, it made it for a broader appeal of comic books. This isn't just a medium for young white men anymore.
Right.
And not saying that it ever was intentionally for that, but of course that was really their main demographic back in the day, probably more so in the golden age. But now we're broadening. It's more a broad appeal. We've got women reading comics. We got little girls reading comics. We got, African Americans. We've got Jewish people. We've got Hispanics reading the comics. Because there's a lot more representation out there. I mean, Shang-Chi comes out to hit the people who are interested in Kung Fu. But
yeah.
But of course, this is also a major turn in the industry, as we talked about earlier. So let me ask you a quick question.
Sure.
Do you know what the direct market is? Is your knowledge of business and economics and all that?
Well, let's see. Give me 5 minutes. I'll look it up on the internet. No, again, taking a guess here. I would say that direct market is where you are putting, something directly into a position where it can be bought instead of having to go to the theaters to watch it, maybe? Essentially.
So, again, we talked about how newsstands didn't really exist anymore. In the 1970s, there's not newsstands. And so you had to find a new way to sell comics, because that was the way you sold comics, was through the newsstand.
Right.
And so you start seeing these little comic book shops start to open up. And what the direct market allowed was for the publishers, DC, Marvel primarily, was they were able to sell directly to these comic book shops.
Okay.
Which then helped reduce the issues with unsold inventory. Because, of course, with newsstands, you're constantly you got to change out. And they would, they would sell them a certain lot of copies. And then if they didn't sell them, what the publishers would do is that the seller would have to rip off the cover and send the cover back in to prove that they were destroying the unsold comics.
Got it.
And they would be partly reimbursed for the comics that they didn't sell. Whereas here in the comic book shops, you could sell a few, and if you had extra, there was room to maybe store a few extra, or you start marking down the cost, and you sell them in the. I still love every now and then when I get the chance to go into a comic book store to find the $1 box.
Oh yeah.
And just rummaging through the $1 box. But also with comic book shops, there were creators who had the ability to do more experimental titles. Things that weren't necessarily a part of DC and Marvel. You could self-publish.
Okay. Yeah.
So you got these smaller comics that are kind of coming out, and some of them would be able to be successful, and some of them necessarily would not. But like I said, it gave creators more freedom. They could do more unconventional stories because they knew that there was now a dedicated audience that was going to support them, and a little bit more freedom to just do what they did, because you're not having to sell to a newsstand. You're not having to sell to a grocery store to hopefully get seen. There are now specialty places, these comic book shops, that people go to specifically buy comic books.
That's nice.
Yeah. But I can't talk about the Bronze Age without talking about one of the biggest comics released. Some people will say that this is the start of the Bronze Age. I don't agree with it, but I do think it is a pivotal part of the Bronze Age, and that is Amazing Spider-Man number 121 that came out in 1973. And it is titled The Night Gwen Stacy Died.
Oh.
And so I don't know how familiar you are with this story, but of course this is the infamous story in which Spider-Man has a choice between who to save and whether to stop the Green Goblin. And the Green Goblin, and ultimately his decision and the Green Goblin cause the death of Gwen Stacy as she falls to her death, which they did portray in Amazing Spider-Man number 2. Not number 2, but Amazing Spider-Man 2, the Andrew Garfield version with Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy.
Yes, I do remember that.
Yeah, they did play out this storyline. But how do you think, Reece, that Gwen Stacy's death impacted readers and eventually impacted the future of comic books?
Well, for one, I imagine it upset a lot of readers. I mean, how could you let...
Absolutely.
Yeah, how could you let the girlfriend die, or, the significant other? So yeah, you'd be pretty upset about that. Mad, angry, you'd want revenge. Maybe you'd want... You would want your hero to take action and do something about it.
Yeah, again, it gets into that darker aspect. It does play with... Spider-Man, who, of course, had already felt responsible for the death of his Uncle Ben, to now this happening to the love of his life, Gwen Stacy. I do know there's one historian, reviewer, or something who has said that this is Gwen Stacy's death was the thud heard around the world.
Oh wow.
It's kind of putting a little bluntly there. But yeah, it demonstrated that comics could carry an emotional weight. But at the same time, it also was one of the first indicators that our beloved characters could die. We had, of course, there are deaths associated with character origins. The Waynes are shot,
right,
and thus Bruce decides to become Batman. Krypton explodes, which gives us Superman. Uncle Ben, as we just talked about, is one of the factors that makes Spider-Man it doesn't necessarily create Spider-Man, but makes Spider-Man a hero instead of just a kid using his powers for his own personal, his own selfishness. We had deaths associated with origins, and we had deaths happen in the comics, but it would be something that could be fixed. As famously as Superman died in the 90s, I've talked about on this show before, back when we did the Summer of Superman. Superman had died in comics before, but he always came back. It was here with the death of Gwen Stacy that people legit went, "Oh,
she's gone."
Like, she's gone. And of course, Gwen Stacy would come back, but it would be a multiverse version of Gwen Stacy.
Okay.
The actual Gwen Stacy that this was would die.
How dare they?
Yeah. And like I said, this was 73, so this was right at the beginning of the Bronze Age, because I said it started roughly around 71. But this helped with the more mature, realistic storytelling. It dealt more with the fact that there are consequences. That superheroes, as much good as they do, there sometimes are going to be things that go wrong. And consequences that they would have to deal with what happens with them. And of course, it set a precedent for what would happen with future comics. The stakes were higher. We now had to worry about our heroes, and we had to worry about characters like Lois Lane and Mary Jane later with Peter Parker, his next love interest. And that helped get readers more emotionally invested in these characters.
Right.
which is what I believe truly happens in this Bronze Age. Yes, the Silver Age started more of the relatability, but I think it's the Bronze Age that more created that emotional tie-in that we had with some of these characters. We actually cared about the characters, and we worried about the characters, and we felt what the characters were feeling and all that.
Do you think it helped the population be more thoughtful about their actions and maybe as, what could be the outcome here?
I think it's very there's very much a study that could go into that even how comic books affected the real world.
Yeah.
Especially when you are talking about some of these stories about drug abuse and drug addiction, could it be that they actually adapted that, or not adapted that, but they actually affected the way some people thought about their own personal maybe drug use. I know that some comics even dealt with kind of depression and their suicidal thoughts.
Yeah.
And having some heroes have to talk someone who was thinking about committing suicide. Talk to them. This isn't from the Bronze Age, but every time I bring up that, I think about All-Star Superman. There's it's just one page out of the comic. You can probably just find the single page online somewhere of where Superman speaks to a young girl who is thinking about jumping off a building, and it's just a powerful scene. So I won't say that kind of vice versa, not just the real world affecting comic books, but there's a chance that Bronze Age you could look through and see how much of the comics actually affected the real world.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. This, of course, gave some creators the ability to start deconstructing superheroes. And so we start seeing right towards the end of the Bronze Age, leading into what is known as the Modern Age, we start seeing writers like Frank Miller and Alan Moore, who kind of started looking more at this, the psychological aspects of superheroes, the moral complexities of superheroes. Like, who are these people that choose to become superheroes? Or what happens to a person when they are given powers? Like, how does this affect the person that is the superhero?
Right.
Frank Miller, of course, would do this with his Daredevil run. Born Again is one of the great Daredevil runs. Alan Moore would do this with his own separate story of Watchmen that was released through DC, but it was completely separate. And those are just prime examples of how the genre evolved to include more of these mature and sophisticated narratives. And of course, Frank Miller would also do the Dark Knight Returns storyline. Of course, Moore would do other stuff that looked at superheroes in other ways. I mean, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen being one. He would do a very compelling story with Swamp Thing, with the saga of Swamp Thing. So how do you think, Reece, the impact of these darker and more introspective stories, how do you think they had on people's perception of superheroes?
I think maybe it drove home the idea that they are, in some respects, just average people with real world problems. We deal with the same things that they're dealing with, and this is how they overcome it. Maybe I can use some of what I'm reading here and overcome some of my issues as well. Maybe. I again, just throwing it out there.
Yeah, but not necessarily overcome, I wouldn't even say. Because especially with Alan Moore, it's showing that these characters are flawed, and they are they're conflicted with what they're doing. Sometimes they're even, you talk about the anti-heroes, sometimes they're even corrupt.
Okay.
And so it again created that sense of that superheroes there's not really necessarily always a black and a white. There isn't always a good side and a bad side. That even these heroes who are supposed to be, these symbols of good, could have some negativity to them, could have some problems, could have some issues that they are having to deal with. But that paved the way for more mature storytelling. which I think also appeals to an older audience because you're looking at, we started in, let's say 1940, even though Superman came out in 38. We started in 1940. We are now into the 70s and 80s. So you're looking at those initial comic book readers at the age of 10 are now in their 50s.
Right.
And comic books have had to adjust not only to the time, not only to the social climate, political climate, all that, but how do you keep a lifelong reader?
You have to adapt.
Yeah. And so having these more complex stories to not only hit possibly the teenagers, the kids, the teenagers, but now to hit the young adults and hit the older people who have been fans of these comics since the beginning.
Right.
You want to keep them invested. And so you have to adapt, like you said. So yeah, that's it. We've reached the end of the finish line for our gold, silver, and bronze. This was the Bronze Age of comics. Again, once again, it's transformative. It's innovative. It leaves an impact to what comics would have. And we're stopping here. Do know that there is another age. It is the age we are currently in. It has probably been the longest age of comics. It's called the modern age. Many believe that began in the 80s with Frank Miller and Alan Moore, with things like The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. And it pretty much continues today. I've never heard anything different, that we've changed to a different age. We're still in the modern age, even now in 2024. So whereas the bronze, silver, and gold age were typically like a decade and a half each, we're now talking about the Bronze Age, pushing, 40 years so far. But like I said, that's going to end us for the Gold, Silver, and Bronze Age for this Olympics-themed series that we've been talking about. So for one last time, I would like to thank my good friend Reece for being my student throughout this Olympic adventure as we've talked about the Gold, Silver, and Bronze Age. So thank you, Reece.
You're welcome, Laramy, and I appreciate the opportunity to chime in with what little bit of knowledge I have and just learn a lot more about these three periods of the comics.
Well, I hope, as I do with many of our listeners, that even if you say you had a limited knowledge of this, that you now have a deeper knowledge of this. You now know more listening to these three one-shots that we've talked about it.
Thank you. I did. Yeah, learned quite a bit.
All right, thanks everyone for tuning in. Rate and review the show, and stay tuned. We're actually not done with our Olympic theme episodes. Our next one-shot is going to be an Olympic/sports-themed game of Jeopardy with a few of my co-hosts. But we'll go ahead and wrap things up for today. For Moving Panels, I'm Laramy Wells, and I'll see you on the other side of the page.